I've been reviewing speakers for about 3 years, and in my time, I've reviewed probably 10 to 12 different Klipsch speakers. And I think out of all of those, I've really only liked maybe one or two. And in the past, I've been labeled all sorts of things, such as a Klipsch hater. So let me clarify right now. I don't hate any particular brand, certainly not Klipsch. The reality is that I just don't particularly care for the way that their speakers are voiced. If you want to call it voiced, then I don't care for the way that they're voiced. However, with that said, the Klipsch, the Nons, definitely my favorite Klipsch speaker that I've heard. Before I go any further, I want to mention one thing that's very important. These speakers came from Audio Advice on loan. Audio Advice is a retailer in North Carolina that has 2 storefronts, and I've worked out a good partnership with them where they just loan me speakers to review, and they ask nothing from me other than I provide an affiliate link in my description, which I will do below. Most manufacturers won't send me anything, but Audio Advice helps me bridge that gap. So huge shout out to the folks at Audio Advice. Let's quickly go over some of the specs of this particular speaker. It is a powered speaker. It features a 1-inch titanium dome tweeter inside of their Track Tricks horn, waveguide, and it also features an 8-inch mid woofer. This speaker plays pretty much flat from about 40 hertz all the way to, let's say, about 10 kilohertz, where there is some rise in the treble. With a caveat, out of the box, there is a rise in the treble of about plus 5 dB from about 2 kilohertz to 20 kilohertz. However, this speaker does use an app where it's super duper easy to basically get into the inside of the speaker and control any of the features via their little intuitive app. So what I did and what I found was that when listening to the speaker, the tweeter level was just too high for me. I wound up knocking it down by about 2 or 3 dB, and I ultimately landed on negative 2 dB, and that's really where I enjoyed listening to this speaker the most. It offers a very nice and neutral sound to it where nothing really stands out. There were a few times where I thought there was going to be some kind of resonance peek its head. And why do I say that? I've heard a bajillion speakers in my time, and there's a lot of tracks that I'm used to showing off resonances within speakers. Those resonances can be port resonances, driver resonances, or enclosure resonances. But typically, when they're about to come up, I almost get hairs on my neck. It's like Spidey sense. Oh, here we go. Here comes a resonance. Every time that I thought that was going to happen with this particular speaker, it didn't happen. That's a great thing. I'm happy when speakers don't make their own resonant panels and just vibrate like crazy. You don't really want extra coloration in your speaker. At least I don't. As I said, this is a powered speaker, and it features a lot of different inputs and outputs. So let's look at a couple of those in the picture. We can see the back features an HDMI ARC, and then it also features optical in, USB, auxiliary in, and phono in. So you can actually plug in a record player directly to this piece. Now, while some may call this a wireless speaker, it's not truly wireless. Number one, you've got to have power. That's to be expected. But the other thing is that there is a direct connection between the main speaker and the secondary speaker. This is the main speaker that I'm showing on the screen, and it shows a secondary speaker output. It's just a long cable that runs to the secondary speaker. No problem. But while it is called a wireless speaker, it is truly actually wired. Most two-way speakers that feature a horn, waveguide, and a mid-woofer have the reference plane between the tweeter and the woofer. And this particular speaker is no different. What do I mean when I say the reference plane? Well, that means where your ears are supposed to line up. If you put your ears directly on line with the tweeter, most of the time, it's going to be a little bit too hot. And if you go below that too much, then it may not be quite treble enough. Treble-y enough? So the ideal placement typically is between those 2 points. So what I've done here is I've labeled a little piece of blue tape, and you can see that I've drawn a dot in. And that's pretty much exactly where your reference point is. So when you're sitting in front of the speaker, make sure your ears line up with this. Reviewing a neutral speaker is actually really kind of tough when you lean toward the subjective. I could throw out all sorts of flowery words. I could say it's a lush mid-range, a sweet upper end. I could do all that stuff, but it's just kind of lame, in my opinion, to babble on when I can just say that the speaker itself is neutral. And you say, well, where's it neutral from? Earlier I said 40 hertz to about 10 kilohertz. That's pretty much dead on. And the data backs that up. So while I'm talking about it, let me just show you the data. This is the frequency response on axis, and then a small listening window of about 30 degrees to the side and plus or minus 10 degrees above and below the reference line. The gray bars are plus and minus 1.5 dB tolerance, and the blue is plus or minus 3 dB tolerance. And if we just look, we can see that generally speaking, this speaker is within plus or minus 1.5 dB until you get to just above 10 kilohertz. And then when you get to around 16 kilohertz, there seems to be some sort of breakup. And my guess is that's going to be some kind of tweeter diaphragm breakup. I'm not 100% sure. It could be something to do with the internals of the waveguide. Maybe there's some sort of diffraction effect. But my guess, my educated guess, is that's tweeter breakup. Did I hear that? No, I don't think I did. But I will say this. Klipsch Connect, the app, has some basic features. It has bass, mid-range, and treble adjustments. But I wish they would go a little bit further. And this was my complaint the last time I reviewed a Klipsch, the 5 speaker. I wish they would go just a little bit further and offer the end user more adjustability in the EQ. So if I wanted to go there and I wanted to knock that down and play around with that, I could. Or let's say there was a resonance in the room, or it was a little bit boomy at 50 hertz because of the room itself. I could just go and drop 50 hertz rather than dropping the whole entire treble. If they would just offer even a 10-band graphic equalizer, that would be great. So that's my request to Klipsch, maybe in a future update, that you guys could do that. As I said earlier, I landed on negative 2 dB, and that's actually how I chose to test this speaker. Generally, what I do is if it's a speaker that has adjustability options for the user to easily adjust, then I'm going to find the best overall response of that speaker, and I'm going to present it in the best overall light. I think that's only fair. However, I do have a comparison between the standard flat DSP and the negative 2 DSP. So let me show you that. Here it is. That's pretty much all it is. At about 2 or 3 kilohertz, we can see that the rise and treble starts. And then what I did was I just tamed that rise a little bit to where it sounded good to my ears, and I continued to test it that way from there on. Let's talk about the spin data. Now, this is the CEA 2034 data set, the overall Spinorama data that helps us understand the performance of the speaker. Good neutral on-axis response. The sound power and the early reflections show something kind of weird happening around 1 kilohertz. What is that? Well, I know just from looking at the speaker that most likely it's going to be the displacement between the tweeter and the midwoofer below it. They're so far apart, it's going to be hard for them to match up the directivity of the midwoofer and the tweeter at 1 to 2 kilohertz. And it's going to be certainly even harder to do it even higher than that. But how do we check that? Well, simple. We just go and look at the vertical response. And here you go. This is the normalized vertical response. Anywhere that this dark red isn't linear, that's a sign that something is happening above or below the reference point. And indeed, what we have is a suck out. So the ideal range to stay within that reference point is within a couple degrees. I would not go any further than plus or minus maybe 5 degrees. Make sure that your eyes are level with that center point I discussed earlier. Remember, it was the blue tape with the dot. And you could also say, hey, maybe there is something in the horizontal response. As you go to the side of the speaker, how's the sound falling off? Is it doing anything different? Because it could be, and that could also contribute to the overall directivity issues that we saw between 1 to 2 kilohertz. So let's go look. This is pretty much textbook smooth. I mean, I don't know that I could ask for a whole lot better. These little dips and wiggles that we see in here, those are going to be waveguide based. And it's going to be hard to get rid of all of those, especially when you're talking about the on-axis response. There's going to be little dips and peaks right in that area. And it's very, very hard for a manufacturer to get to the point where those don't exist at all. So that's a good trade-off, and I'm completely okay with it. Now let's look at the estimated in-room response, and we can see that there's a pretty smooth trend line throughout on the speaker. Now there still is a little bit of lift in the upper treble, and that is noticeable. That's again why I wish that Klipsch would offer a little bit of EQ ability beyond just the 3 bands of tonality changes. If I had something at 10K that I could adjust, that would be cool. Or maybe, again, if there was something in the room that I wanted to correct for, that would be really great as well. But all things considered, this really looks quite good, and it sounds really good. Let's look at distortion real fast. At 86 dB at 1 meter, below 1% THD, and I'm really surprised, even on the bass, how good it is. That's really quite remarkable. Then at 96 dB, you're still below 3% THD at 50 hertz, all the way down to about 30 hertz. That's really quite good. Now, I know this is an 8-inch midwoofer, but I've seen other 8-inch speakers have worse results. In terms of multi-tone distortion, which is done to emulate real music, we can see that the overall distortion is, again, pretty low. Generally speaking, negative 30 dB is where my kind of cutoff point is, my mental cutoff. And anything above that, I'm kind of like, you're getting into the audibility range at that point. Below that, I'm like, you're okay. There are two things about this particular speaker that aren't quite that great. One of them, not really a big deal, and the other one is completely preference based. So let's talk about the first one, and that's going to be compression. How much limiting is there in the output of the speaker as you turn it up? What happens? Well, we can see in this response graph that overall, the compression or limiting of the speaker is good up until about 96 dB at 1 meter. But if you're looking for the purple line and thinking, where is it? It's because it's way below the negative 3 dB axis. The DSP on this thing is saying, hey, I can't do that. I'm going to limit the output to protect myself. I've run into that with other power speakers, and audibly, it's not really been an issue because you're not listening to a perfect sine wave the whole time. You're listening to music that might clip the little indicators just for a microsecond or what's something even lower than that, a nanosecond or something. It's super infinitesimal, relatively speaking, in time. So you don't really hear that instantaneous clipping. Genelec is another brand that I've run into that with, where they just basically drop the whole treble from like 4 or 5 kilohertz and above. And I didn't even hear that. And others have talked about that as well in their reviews. So I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, oh, 102 dB is not on there, but I also know that I just hammered these speakers and didn't really have a problem. I would think that for the most part, if you're listening to these speakers, even at high output volume, you're not really going to run into any issues unless you just get crazy, stupid loud, like a house party or something. And then in which case, you don't even need to be using these kind of speakers. You need like pro audio stuff. So if you're sane and you're listening to reasonable levels, I don't think you're going to have an issue with the limiter here. The second thing that I was talking about is the radiation pattern in the horizontal area. If you've watched my reviews, you know I like a wider radiating speaker most of the time. This speaker is pretty dang narrow. It's about plus or minus 30 degrees, and I generally prefer something that's like plus or minus 60 or 70 or 80, somewhere in that ballpark. I just like a wider radiating speaker. Why? Because most of the time it gets more room, involvement, and things like that. You do that at a trade-off of imaging focus. So the instrument's in the middle of the soundstage as it goes across. You may lose some focus when you have a wider radiation and more things going on in the room. These are just trade-offs, and these are inherent in all audio designs. So whether or not you like a particular radiation pattern, you may not know yet, but that's the cool thing about the data, because if you go and listen to the speaker and then you listen to another speaker that's similar but has a wider radiation, you might be able to understand that that's what I like. That does it for this review. Again, in conclusion, a Klipsch speaker that I really actually like, the best Klipsch speaker I think that I've heard so far. Really good, powerful, low bass, and in the room it got down to about 30 hertz. Anechoic, it's bound to about 40 hertz or so, and it's very neutral. If you want to go and change the EQ profile to your own liking or per song or whatever you want to do, even if you're not supposed to, we won't get into that. Even if you're not supposed to, even if you're a purist of audio, you can go and do that. You can go change that. You've got HDMI inputs, optical, phono, you've got Bluetooth as well, which I think I failed to mention. Various inputs for you to use for whatever. Plenty of output, nice overall neutral sound. Narrow sound stage might be a problem for you, but other than that, I have zero problem recommending the speaker. And if it were wider sound staging, I'd probably consider buying a pair for myself. If you appreciate this review and you learned something, please give me a thumbs up at the bottom or leave me a comment if you have any questions. Again, I want to shout out to Audio Advice for loaning me this pair of speakers. They don't tell me what to say. They don't even see this review. Most of the time I have to tag them so they'll know. So anyway, especially thank you to Heather at Audio Advice, because she's my, consultant? What's the word I'm looking for there? Liaison? Anyway, the person that I talk with who really goes out of her way to help me out with all this stuff. And I know she's super busy, so I want to send a personal thank you to Heather. Thank you for watching again. If you're interested in joining my Patreon to help this channel out, you can get to see behind the scenes kind of information and all the stuff that I'm doing and I'm working on, and personal votes and discussions and things like that. Then please join me at patreon.com/Erin's Audio Corner. I will talk to you all later. Take care. Peace.